Hi, everyone. So I'm so excited to be here leading off the series. So I am going to, I just want to make sure if somebody can go ahead and type in the chat that you can see me, that you can still see the screen. I'm just going to do a couple shifts and I just want to make sure everything is still good. Perfect. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, awesome. So going ahead and getting started, we are going to talk today about knowing our value and how to communicate it. So really my goal, and when I initially talked to Shannon, why I wanted to present this topic to all of you today is thinking about the idea of worth and value and the ways in which we're communicating that with ourselves and those around us is one of the biggest hurdles that I see people facing personally and professionally. And particularly with the organization that you all are a part of, the work that you do, this is something that is a hurdle and a roadblock, both because of internal biases, but also because of cultural norms and biases and structures that are happening outside of you. So really my hope is for us to get a deeper understanding of what some of these terms mean, talk about maybe some of those barriers that we're facing, and then I'm going to give you some very tangible next steps that you can use to start implementing and making some changes today. One of the things I know Shannon mentioned it, you are welcome to ask questions as we go. If we get on a topic and have some discussion and that feels more pertinent than the things I've prepared, I'm totally on board with that. And if we wait till the end and we get to as many questions as we can, that works too. So a little bit about me. I just wanted to share some of my background, why I have a little authority to kind of talk on these subjects. So I have a master's degree in counseling psychology, and I work as a licensed clinical therapist in Milwaukee, just south of Portland. I specialize in eating disorders, anxiety disorders, and trauma. I also have my company Adversity Rising, where I focus on broader concepts and terms that really show up in the therapy field, but are things that everyone, regardless of a diagnosis or not, are struggling with. And my focus is really on taking things out of the therapy room and applying these concepts and inviting conversations in the community to really allow us to make those changes internally and externally to create structures that are more supportive and to limit the need for things like therapy. So my focus in these conversations and the work that I do is really on four main pieces. I work on communication, particularly assertive communication, fear, shame, and then how to help people shift from this idea of busyness or perpetual motion to being more intentional and productive. So these are things I'm happy to answer questions about as we go. You'll notice parts of this coming up throughout the presentation today. And again, if you have more questions about me, you're welcome to ask, but we're here to talk more about this topic. So we're going to go ahead and dive in. So one of the things that's really key, I think, is whenever we're talking about these major ideas of worth, value, communication, that we have a shared language and a shared view and understanding of what these mean so that the shifts we're making can be in alignment with each other and with the outcomes that we're all hoping for. So when I say worth and value, these are two terms that are actually very different, but are often seen as synonymous. So when we talk about value and knowing our value, we're actually talking about understanding our strengths, our contributions, our education, our experiences, our internal sense of self, and the offering that we bring simply by being who we are and for all of the things that we've done to cultivate that sense of self. Our worth is then what we get in exchange for that value. So for example, if anybody grew up during the time of Beanie Babies, there was this huge rush and shift, right? That the value of the Beanie Babies to people seemed like that was this big deal and it was going to be amazing and people were going to make all this money. And I remember watching this really interesting video that showed people actually going bankrupt by over investing in Beanie Babies because over time, the worth that people placed on or what they were willing to spend on the value of this toy changed. So when we're talking about this, we're going to be looking at then how we can communicate our value to find consistent and growing worth in terms of not only what we're paid, so not just financial payback, but also in the investment that we make and that others make in us in terms of their energy and their time. I also think it's important that we talk about communication. So communication breaks down into really two key components. There's the type or the style of communication, and then there's the form of communication. We're going to look at both of them and then apply these concepts all in one big spectrum. So the first, if we're thinking about types of communication, and many of you are probably familiar, you will have heard some of these, so I may be repeating this to some of you. The first is passive communication. Passive communication, if any of you are from the Midwest originally, or if you've been there or been any place with lots of snow, you may have played the game King of the Hill, which was basically the world's unsafest game. I'm not really sure how they let us do this, but it was that snowplows would come and they would plow up all this snow. And then the goal was that you would play on it and try to get to the top. And there was only one king of the hill. And so you just wanted to get up there. I use this idea as kind of a concept or a metaphor for how these different types of communication show up. So if you imagine somebody's at the top of the hill, passive communicators are going to be the people that stay at the bottom of the hill and aren't trying to come up to the top. They sort of find the shadow, they exist in the bottom. It's really a place of subservience. It's very much a role of us taking care of other people and prioritizing others or the needs of others, or over prioritizing harmony and balance over other things in life. The second is passive aggressive. These are going to be the kids that were on the playground that are going to be off, not even by the mountain, that are not going to want to do any of it. They're like, oh, I'm too cool for this. I don't want to do anything. I don't want to be a part of this. When in reality, they really want to play, but that sort of self-doubt or that fear that things aren't going to work out the ways that they want to, or that they're not going to be included, takes over. And so instead they just sort of pull back. This type of communication for us is going to come up a lot, particularly in work settings, where we might feel like we've been passive and we're starting to reach an endpoint and becoming resentful, or maybe it feels unsafe to say the things we need or want to say, but we still have that emotion building up inside. And so we just start to isolate, and we start to kind of push people away, and we communicate and bring up things that might not always be pertinent to what's happening in the room or what's happening in that conversation, but as a way to kind of put people down and keep a distance. These are all forms of protection. This is something, and I just want to mention, I do a 10-week course on communication training. So I'm boiling down a lot of topics into a 45-minute presentation that we might normally take 10 or 12 weeks to really go over. And so as I'm going through this, please know that if you want more information, I'm happy to share resources for you to go deeper, but I do know that I'm obviously throwing a lot at you in a short amount of time. And then the last main one is aggressive. And so aggressive communicators are the people that are often at the top or are getting to the top. And the only way they see themselves as getting there is to push everybody else down to the bottom. And so if you think about that, that is people that are potentially, you walk in and maybe immediately they're being rude or hurtful, or they say something that seems like it comes out of nowhere that just makes you feel like all you can do is to be silent in order to protect yourself. Now, all of us do all three types of these communications, and we have go-tos or primary roles of communication we use most commonly. Each one of these forms of communication is indirectly related to any sense of worth and value, in the sense that the more I communicate through one of these lenses, the less worth and value that I'm going to feel or ascribe to myself, or that I'm going to receive from others. So the fourth type of communication that really lines up more directly, the more we do it, the more we can contribute to our worth and value, is assertive. And so assertive communication is really independent of anybody else. If you kind of think about all these other ones, I involved other people in the game and how we're responding to others. Assertive communication is about making space for ourselves, making space for everybody else, and respecting and holding that space for all of us in the room. Assertive communication is also really about communicating from a place of balance. So we might still factor in our emotions, but emotions are not the driving force for communication, which is not the case when it comes to the other three. If you have questions about these, and again, want to know more, you can type them into the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to go into the second part, which is thinking about, okay, then what are the forms of communication? So I know all of us have heard of verbal and nonverbal communication, but just a reminder that verbal communication is one of the primary means of communicating. It's not necessarily the dominant or the only way of communicating, and how we talk and the way that we are saying things out loud is in direct correlation to someone else's perception of our worth and is how we show how we understand our value. Now, most of you have probably heard that nonverbal communication makes, 70 to 80% of our communication and all of that, which is great. It's incredibly important. We're going to talk about our actions and our behaviors as well. What we're really going to be looking at is how we're communicating verbally affects our nonverbals very directly and vice versa. And so I'm going to give you some actual tips and tricks on how we can shift into more of an assertive stance, both in how we're talking, what we're saying, as well as how we show up physically in the space, and really think about how those shifts then again will more directly line up with knowing our value and our worth. And then there's two other forms that are often missed or that people forget about. So the first is tech, or sometimes people refer to it as passive communication, meaning it can be one-sided. So for example, if I send an email, I might not get a response for a day or a week or a month. If I send a text message, it's a one-sided conversation until that other person responds. So tech-based communication has really complicated our understanding of assertive communication, and also really shifts our ability to think about what does it look like to communicate our worth and value. So I don't know if anyone else has ever felt this way, but you'll get an email from somebody that seems very short, very direct, and you perceive that as being hurtful or curt. I remember that if I didn't, especially living in the Midwest for a long time, if there wasn't like a paragraph about the weather and about how things were going and people wishing me well, if they just got to the point, I assumed I had done something wrong. So this opened up a lot of floodgates for a lot of biases that we already had about our interactions with other people and maybe our question of our worth and of our value. And it really made it more complicated. So this is something that when I'm teaching a course, I actually spend an entire week talking about tech-based communication. So we'll hit on this a little bit as we go. And if you have specific questions of how to apply it when we look at some of the skills, let me know. For right now, just think about it in the sense that this includes our emails, our texts, any form of chat or online or digital communication that you're using through your workplace setting. This also includes things like social media, whether that is through messaging or in our direct way of communicating as well. And then the final form of communication is self-talk. And this is actually the most important form of communication. So again, it can be assertive, passive aggressive, aggressive, or passive. Our focus is going to be shifting it to this more assertive lens. What we're actually going to be looking at here is that our self-talk is the root of our communication with everybody else. And so this is usually the place that's hardest to go to and the most important place to spend a lot of time on if we're going to really dive deep into better understanding our value, both personally and professionally, and how we want to communicate that with the world around us. So that being said, I know I'm starting to kind of build a foundation for why we want to work on assertiveness, but just to really talk about the brain a little bit and why this is beneficial is to think about how communication creates a feedback loop to our brain. So how we communicate with ourselves and with others is at the core of all of our interactions. We have to communicate in order to have anything done, in order to interact with other people and the work that we're doing. It's all done through communication. Even if we're creating, let's say, a handout to send to somebody, that is a passive or tech-based form of communication. That is something that how we communicate through that, it decides whether or not we have a successful interaction with whoever's using that handout. The same is true then for how we're showing up in salary negotiations or when we are interviewing, when we're interacting with coworkers. Now, the issue here is that how we communicate directly creates feedback loops for our brain. So our brain is incredibly complex. It does so many things that we don't even yet fully understand. And the brain is trying to be as efficient as possible by automating and kind of simplifying everything that it can. So the more that we communicate in a certain way, the more that we expect or anticipate certain interactions, the more that anxiety gets correlated with any type of confrontation or discussion, our brain tries to code all of that and just tries to automate it so that it has systems in place to just respond the way it thinks it's supposed to. So for example, if you think about kids, or if you're like me, some adults that are petrified of needles, the communication that has gone around this, right, is I'm telling myself that it's going to hurt. I'm scared. All of this is going to be terrible. I go in and I'm anxious. I have all of these feelings. Then the behavior is probably that I end up crying. I end up feeling really terrible. They do hurt a little bit, right? So my brain goes, okay, rather than investing every time and trying to decide whether or not the next shot's going to be painful, if this could be, better or worse, we're just going to assume all shots are painful. So this is problematic. This is also where things come from, where people assume they had a hard time public speaking. So they've told themselves, they communicated to themselves, they're not a good public speaker for years, sometimes decades. Well, your brain's just going to automatically assume then every time something comes up that you have to speak publicly, that you are going to be anxious and you're not going to do well. This is also true then with any type of interaction. If someone says, I'm not good with conflict, well, the reason you're not good with conflict is you've told your brain that you're not good with conflict to the point that now it's not going to assume that you can do it. And again, all of this over time starts to come together and becomes the formulation of how we see our value. To break this down just a little bit further, we're going to look at how our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors really then are the sort of primary point of how all of these things come together. So if anyone is familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, this is something that really kind of gets brought up in here, but it's really an overarching theme I see being applied to everybody at any point in their lives. So what it talks about is how our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors all directly correlate and feed onto each other. So what I'm thinking, kind of go back to that shot example, what I'm thinking affects what I feel. What I feel affects my behavior, and my behaviors then in turn affect my thoughts. Now this all, again, you see the double arrows, it can go in all of these different directions. So if I have, let's say, for example, thoughts that I am not good enough, that I haven't earned my right to speak at this conference, or let's even use the example of giving this talk today. If I have thoughts about, I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't work in higher education. I don't know if I can communicate about this to other people. What if I don't know enough? Who am I to talk about this? Well, the feelings that are naturally going to come up would be something like anxiety, self-doubt. I might have some physical reactions, some distress. I might have some fear. Well, that's going to factor into my behaviors. That's going to make me either overcompensate and try to do so much that it's overwhelming, or that might make me actually start to think that I can't do this. And then in turn, I'm not going to deliver my best talk. Well, if that happens, now think and play this through again and kind of go through the spiral. My thoughts after the fact aren't going to be great. My feelings aren't going to be great. And then maybe my behavior over time, if I start to think, see, it didn't go well, and then I feel bad, I might not apply to talk about these things anymore. And I might take myself out or sort of isolate myself from these opportunities and these conversations. So if you think about this in relation to your work, again, personal and professional, again, this goes back to why self-talk becomes that key starting point, is what we think affects what we feel and how we behave. And those things then enact a feedback loop that just keeps spiraling and leading to more of that, again, oversimplified, but automated response of the brain. So I want to also talk a little bit about then what actually gets in the way of being assertive in the sense of our overarching understanding of communication. So it's not just, okay, you had a negative thought and these things then became really difficult, or suddenly you suck at communicating. It takes a really long time, and there are a lot of influences that are independent of you that have shown up or gotten in the way of this type of communication, or have influenced that spiraling in a way that's led you to become passive-aggressive, or an aggressive communicator, and to doubt your value, and as such, not communicate your worth in the way that is helpful for you and where you want to go. So the first thing that's really important to think about is early childhood experiences. This has both to do with our direct and indirect way of communicating with people around us. So what do people say to us? How are they responding to us? What are the things that we saw in terms of how people were communicated to, or how people responded when someone communicated? How were you treated when you talked different ways? It's also really important to think here. We have, as we know, intersecting identities. So however you identify in terms of your gender, of your sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic status, all of these different identities intersect to create your overall sense of self. Well, your early experiences of how you saw someone treated with those different identities, or how people with those identities communicated, really heavily influenced how you understood and the basis for your self-talk and your communication with others. So if I saw women speaking in a certain way, I identify as female. If I saw women speaking in a certain way and or were responded to when they spoke in a certain way, I'm going to internalize that as that's how women should or shouldn't talk. And these are the ways that women are supposed to present in the world. One of the other things that's really key, and again, this is a topic that both of these terms are so deep and could be hours and hours in and of themselves, but thinking about shame and fear. So if you aren't familiar with Brené Brown does a lot of work on shame and vulnerability research. I'll just kind of give you an overview of the two terms. Shame is basically the threat or the worry that there is going to be a disruption to our belonging in the world. And belonging and connection is actually seen as an equal, if not higher, need when we think about hierarchy of needs as food and shelter and water. We have to belong. If we don't have a sense of connection or belonging, we are completely disrupted. It causes mental and physical distress, emotional pain. And so our brain is constantly surveying for threats to that connection. And shame, unfortunately, kind of overemphasizes the threat and tells us that if we're too much ourselves or too different, then we aren't going to be accepted and the threat becomes more real. Fear works very similarly. And if any of you have studied fear before, you know it's actually in a very different part of your brain. And so when we feel fear, the whole point of it is to actually stop us from dying, to keep us safe. But our brain, over time, as threats to our survival have gone down, it's actually our fear brain has gotten an uptick and goes off all the time. The reason being is there's so much more ambiguity now in the world. There's so much more of a sense of choice and control, even though sometimes that's a little bit false, that we have as much control as we perceive. But the amount of options and ambiguity and the fear of the unknown, or the fear of failure, which kind of aligns with that shame sense of being othered, all comes in and it kicks up our fear brain all the time. And it tells us, okay, you should just kind of stay in the shadow. You should just keep communicating this way. We don't need to break out of that, what I see as the predictable existence. I usually use another word, but just in case there are young ears around there, it starts with an S. And so if that's the case, our brain goes, okay, I'm just going to stay within the confines of what I know and what I can predict. So both of these affect our communication in the sense that the more they become activated, the more our brain tells us, okay, don't push the status quo. What happens if you fail? Even what happens if you succeed and then you can't keep up with it or you don't like it? So we should just stay here. Things are fine. The term fine comes up a lot. We start to perfect our existence. And again, this threat then of if I don't perform and stay at this level, I'm not going to be accepted. And this goes hand in hand with imposter syndrome. So really this fear that we're going to be found out, this fear that people have somehow perceived us as having more ability than we actually do. And so if people find us out, then we are going to be, again, that threat to connection is going to be activated. And then self-esteem, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because really we've been talking about it in relation to all of these pieces. But just to reiterate, our self-talk is directly correlated with our self-esteem. Self-esteem is a cognition. It's the thoughts and beliefs that we have about ourselves and the place that we have in the world. And so this is connected to something that's called core beliefs, which is really at our innermost core. Think of like those giant jawbreakers that were so dumb that we would buy and nobody would ever finish them and get to the middle. is that it's that really key central core of what we believe to be true, and all of our sense of self gets built around that. So if at our core we believe that we're inherently just not good enough, we're not lovable, that we have to earn that sense of worth in the world around us, we're not going to be starting from a place of communicating value, because we inherently don't believe we have it when we're communicating. And then implicit bias and cultural norms, this is twofold. So this is our internalized biases, what we've come to understand and how we perceive the world based on our identities and the identities of others, as well as the norms around us. So this is other biases and the ways that others respond or treat us as well. So think about this in terms of, again, your intersecting identities, but also just identities as a whole. There could be two people that have all of the same identities, except maybe, let's say, one is in a bigger body and one is in a smaller body. How they communicate, let's say same tone, same voice, same inflection, everything is consistent. What's the perception of somebody in a bigger body versus a smaller body if they're being more authoritative? Similarly, let's think about somebody that identifies as cisgender male versus anybody else in terms of their presentation. Again, what assumptions do we make if somebody is more authoritative or if they communicate in a more blunt or direct way? Is there a difference in how we perceive that? All of those biases that we hold affect our sense of understanding our value. So if I think about this, this is why notoriously there have been studies on people who identify as female who ask for, or they're going into negotiations. This is why this is so problematic, is the internalized and external bias that we have around women asking for things, and what that means if somebody asserts themselves and the interpretation that is made. So I might not ask for what I want to be paid because I'm already assuming that I should just be grateful to have had the opportunity, or I am not yet deserving of that. My value is not high enough, even though somebody else, and what the research shows is traditionally more cisgender males, will not even have those thoughts in their head. They will ask for what they want without telling themselves that they don't deserve that. So again, this is not to knock on anyone who's identifies as cisgender male or not. This is to just say this is how bias affects us in the world. And then the last thing to think about is context and environment. So this kind of overlaps with when we think about cultural norms and biases, but this is specifically thinking about the context and environment that you exist in different roles. So in your personal life, if you are around a partner or friends or your kids, if you are in your professional setting, when you're around your boss or superiors, or when you're around people that you might supervise, or with students, all of those different roles and hats affect the way that we see ourselves and how we think we're supposed to communicate in the world, right? What's acceptable or proper. And the other thing with that is to think about the environments we exist in. Again, our brain is trying to simplify things. So it's also looking for patterns in the world around us. If the context and environment that I exist in is everybody's passive aggressive, well, it's likely that I'm going to adopt a passive aggressive communication style, even if that's not my go-to. I worked recently with a construction company, and I went in, we were talking about communication, and we were looking at from the top down and the bottom up, how do we all communicate with each other? And the primary means of communicating is much more aggressive, if not somewhat passive aggressive at times. So we had this whole conversation around how does that continue to perpetuate as new people come on, this unhelpful culture of communication. So this is, again, just kind of looking at things that might happen outside of you that make it more challenging for us to disrupt all of these pieces overall. So what's the outcome? And I know I kind of mentioned this in the write-up, and we're leading to this overall, but the three biggest things that people then are affected by with all of this is that we have a difficult time giving and receiving feedback. This is where a lot of people tend to overemphasize that any type of disruption or any type of discourse that is not fun or happy could be a fight or conflict or criticism. So we have a really hard time engaging in the feedback process, personally and professionally. We have a hard time advocating for our needs. So letting people know what we need, telling people when things aren't right, when we don't feel heard, we start to adopt, again, that sense of, oh, I'm fine. You know, I hate my job. My boss doesn't acknowledge anything that I do. I never feel heard in my meetings, but I'm fine. It's fine, right? So we start to adopt this sense of complacency. And then it really affects our ability to set boundaries. And this is key when it comes to then we overextend how we spend our time, money, and energy on those around us rather than investing our time, money, and energy on ourselves, which then has a direct effect on how we see ourselves and our value. If we overvalue other people and we see them as being more worthy of our time and our money and our energy, we're going to have a really difficult time expending that on us or setting the boundaries that we need to for others to also respond and give us our worth in response. So what I'm going to do now is walk through, we kind of talked through this model, right, of each of these three pieces, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. We're going to look at, okay, now how do we start to make some subtle shifts? Again, a lot of this stuff that I'm talking to you about, I would go over in the course of weeks to really give you the space to dissect it, to process it, to be talking with other people, to be really doing some deeper dives. What I want us to be doing today is, I'm hoping part one, right, is giving you some background and starting to cultivate curiosity, thinking more about the stories that have been existing in your life, how all of these things from the time that you were young have formulated the way that you show up in the world. So if I believe that I have to be subservient, if I, as a female, am supposed to be more passive, or that my role is to take care of everything for everyone else, it's likely going to be that that has then been reiterated year after year after year, and in all of my different personal and professional relationships. So really getting curious about, without judgment, without blaming yourself or other people, but just what some of those barriers have been and how maybe that's affected your communication of your sense of self, both in terms of your self-talk and the way that you exist in your own brain, but also how you show up in the world. Now, the second part, again, is we're not fixing everything, right? Everything that we talk about in the world and how we really have lasting change is to talk about graded, sustainable changes. So now what I'm going to do is just give you a couple of ideas of things that you can start to put into practice now while you're still going through that process of curiosity to start to shift just a little bit of those brain patterns to move into more of that assertive type of communication. So first, we're going to talk about how we shift our thinking. So predominantly, we need to do an initial assessment of our thoughts. So what is the role of our thoughts right now? And this is something that I talk to a lot of people about. I have them go through this exercise. I'm happy to share resources on this if this is helpful to you. You'll have all my contact info if you find yourself getting stuck. But basically what you want to do is do a brain dump of all of the thoughts, particularly all of the thoughts you have about yourself and in response to interactions with other people in the world. Sit down, maybe set a timer for 10 minutes, dump out everything that you're thinking. Go through your interactions, what you think in the mirror, all of that. Then looking at each thought, I want you to label whether or not they are positive, negative, or neutral. And then if they're a fact or an opinion. And my guess is when you do this, you're going to notice that most of your thoughts, particularly, again, those thoughts about yourself and your assessment of your value, are going to be negative opinions. But over time, they've seemed to become perceived truths because we experience them so much. So what we need to go back and do is actually first just even identify that these are opinions and that they're negative. And no, the goal now isn't to shift to these positive opinions or positive facts all the time. If we swing too far in the other end, actually what our brain does is it's like a human BS detector, and it'll go off and be like, no, no, and it'll shoot right back to the other side. Instead, what we want to do is look at, okay, where do these thoughts even come from? Who initially wrote those stories or gave me the script through in which I started to see myself as the problem? How did I create the narrative that I have all of this responsibility or that I have such a negative effect? And then secondly, how might I be able to shift these to a more neutral setting? So rather than thinking everybody hates me or I'm never going to get a job, thinking I might not get a job for a while, that doesn't mean I'm not qualified. Or not everyone will like me, that doesn't mean that I don't have value. And then along with this, as you get to know more of your thoughts and do your assessment of that, you start to work on re-anchoring the narrative. So I do a lot of imagery around kind of thinking about authoring our own story. And so if you were, from the time you were young, right, when we go back and look at those hurdles and those barriers, a lot of your story was written for you based on the experiences that you had and the identities that you hold. And so it's our job then to shift to becoming the author of our own narrative, but to also shift then the ways in which we do it. Because currently, when we are writing our own stories, we're writing the stories as if we're the problem, not only of our lives, but everybody else's. We assume a responsibility that if someone else is upset, it was probably me. I did something wrong. If I don't get the job, or if I get turned down, or if somebody is angry in an interaction, or if I made plans and people didn't have fun, I just assume that all of it is on me and it's a responsibility that I have to hold. So re-anchoring the narrative is shifting ourselves. We should still be the center of our story, but not the problem center of our story. Problems will come in and they'll ebb and flow, and then we write our story in terms of how we respond and make meaning of them versus seeing us as the problem. And then secondly, we shift ourselves from not being the anchor point or the sort of center of everybody else's story. And the thing I tell myself is that I'm ultimately not that important to everybody else. Not everybody's having a bad day because of me. I don't have that much power and effect on everyone. That sounds terrible, but the reality is it's very freeing, because the more we assume that, right, the more we hyper focus on everybody else's narrative and not our own. The other thing that's really important is to, and I love this quote by Katerina Fake, it says, "Stop chasing prizes you don't want." We need to assess what we actually want, who we want in our lives, what we want to be doing, what we want to be paid. Go in and think about your time, your money, and your energy, and what you want from all three of those things, how you want to be spending them, what payouts you want, and then do an assessment of how you're currently spending your time now. And there's the second handout, which I think is going to come out next week in the email. We can probably upload it here as well into the chat. But it's called Assessing Your, say, Resources. The title is a slightly different word. When you go through that, what you're actually looking at is, how am I spending my time, my money, and my energy? And who's that for? And then shifting to, what do I actually want, and how do I make those decisions that are more in line with that? Because the more that you make that internal shift in how you're spending your time, money, and energy, perhaps you're not answering your emails at home on the weekends, you're not the one that's constantly available or can say yes to every project because you're investing your time or energy in other things, the more other people are going to start to respond, and their perception of your worth is going to increase overall. And then the last thing in terms of our thoughts is, and I tell myself this every day, it's not my business what others think of me. Now, the key thing here is, I'm not saying go off and be a terrible human and whatever anybody perceives is totally fine. It's really about kind of a two-step process. One, part of re-anchoring in the narrative is getting clear on your values and your internal passions and motivators for what you do. There's a reason why we choose the jobs we choose. There's a reason why we feel drawn and have goals and dreams and visions that we do, and those connect to our sense of value and they connect to our passions. So the more we reconnect with that and shift from feeling like everybody else's perception of me is what defines my value and as such my worth, to, wait a minute, I define my value and I'm the one that puts it out there and demands that worth, the more that I start to shift from that place of being passive or subservient or less than, or again, existing in other stories, to existing in my own. So the second part then, we're going to talk about how we shift our verbal communication. So a couple key things. These are all, again, very small things that we can start to implement right now as we're doing that deeper dive. So the first is to set preemptive boundaries. Tell people in advance what the boundary is. My classic example of this, particularly in a work setting and even sometimes in personal settings, is when you pick up the phone or somebody comes into your office or somebody asks if you have time, tell them how much time you are going to give them right up front. It doesn't even have to mean that you have something scheduled right afterwards. You can say, I have 10 minutes. Does that give us enough time, or would you like to set a different time to follow up on this? Because every time that somebody else comes in and they're asking us for a handout of our time, or they want to overextend and kind of diminish our boundary and we don't set it, again, we are reinforcing that we have less value to ourselves and we're not communicating the worth to other people of our time. And so in advance, we tell people, I can give you 5 minutes right now, right? Or, hey, I can't talk right now. I'm in the middle of doing a few other things. I would love to catch up with you later. And so setting those boundaries right up front and letting people know what those limits are. The second piece is to remove the words I think before any way that you describe yourself. So I think I'm good at blank versus I'm good at blank. I think I'm a pretty good public speaker versus I'm a good public speaker. Either way, they're subjective interpretations, and people have the right to have a different subjective opinion. But the more that you introduce doubt or possibility that you're wrong in the way you're communicating to other people, and this is an internal thing as well, the more you are, again, demeaning your value, the more you're telling yourself that you don't have the right to be talking about or doing these things. Saying no, this is, again, one of the things that in my communication course will take an entire session to talk about, plus homework and lots of resources. But the thing I think is most important and really helps us shift our thinking is the more we say yes to people and the sort of constant need to say yes to everything around us, the more we exist from a place of scarcity and the more we perpetuate that shame and fear mentality. Because we believe if we don't say yes, then someone's going to be mad at us, or we aren't going to have any friends, or another opportunity isn't going to come along. As an entrepreneur, I did this when I was starting my business. Even when I was starting in private practice as a therapist, I have to say yes to everybody, because otherwise, what if I don't get enough clients? Or what if I don't get another speaking opportunity? So all of that reinforces that you do not have enough value to expect that you are worth all of those things happening. Now, I still have to put the work in to get them, but that doesn't mean that I have to get myself in a position where I'm saying yes to everything. And again, spending my time, my money, my energy on things that don't actually align with my values and get me to where I want to go. So if you think about making this shift, I'm not saying that it's an all or nothing. You should say yes to everything or no to everything, but I just want you to pause the next time that somebody asks for a handout of your time or your energy. And really think about when you're saying yes, if you want to be saying yes, and if not, what's getting in the way of saying no? You might still end up saying yes. You might not be ready to set that boundary, but again, at least introducing that curiosity component is the next step in starting to make that graded change. Now, I think this is the most difficult thing when it comes to our shifts in terms of our verbal, but it's being patient and letting silence speak for itself. So when we are uncomfortable, we fill silences because we've, again, written the story that we are the problem. So I've done this before when somebody asks for my price for speaking at an event, or what's the cost to work with me for coaching. And then there's silence. And then I start to fill in the gap because I'm worried they are perceiving it as not being worthy of their time and energy or their money or whatever it is. And I'm suddenly backsliding. I'll go, well, maybe we could do this. Or here's this one offer. Here's a special thing I can do for you. Well, the immediate moment that I do that and I start filling in silence, one, I'm making an assumption about what's happening in their brain. The assumption I'm making is, again, that I'm the problem at the center of what their thoughts are and their narrative. Two, I've completely just diminished my worth and value. I have told them that it's okay to not actually pay me what I'm worth. I've told them, again, this is the same thing about whether it's my time, my money, my energy. If I'm taking back once I set a boundary because I feel like they're distressed, I'm creating this opportunity for them to then perpetuate feeling as though they can treat me with less worth. And then asking yourself if it's your responsibility. So in that moment of silence, or in that moment when somebody else is interpreting things, is it actually your responsibility to even respond? Is it my responsibility to fill the silence? If I say something or I do something and someone's upset with me, say I say no to plans and they're upset, is that my responsibility to take on? Again, by then questioning my value and saying, well, I'm only a good friend if I then make sure that I go, or if I take care of that, or they're upset, so I have to make sure I prioritize that at my own expense, I'm diminishing my value in that room. Now, it's different if I blew them off, if they came to talk to me about what was upsetting them afterwards, or I said something and something was problematic, that's different. But making the assumption that it's me and that I have to take care of it is, again, that reperpetuation that my investment in myself is less valuable than my investment in them. And then just two other quick things before we get into some action points in the last few minutes. Watch your tone and inflection. Now, this is key when it comes to, again, understanding our intersecting identities and some of the ways that people respond based on our identity. Now, some of it I think is other people's things that they need to deal with. And I'm not telling anybody that they should not communicate with authority. What I'm saying instead is to think about how a lot of times if we've internalized that bias, we're going to automatically shift to tones and inflections that are going to suggest that we have less value. So it's very consistent across the board that when people are negotiating, that people who identify as female or gender non-binary will have inflections that go up, almost like they're saying, maybe pay me this much. Maybe I want this job. Maybe I need 2 weeks off, versus this is what my base rate is. I need 2 weeks off in order to take this job, or whatever the statement is that we want to make. So those inflections end up being a response because we believe, based on our internalized biases, that we don't have the right to ask for them. So just pay attention to when you do this, maybe even asking a coworker or a friend to pay attention when you have these interactions and give you some of that feedback so you can start to notice when you're doing it to make those subtle shifts and changes. And then with this, I'm actually going to tie these two in together. So in terms of closed loop communication and what's called an and statement. So two things happen when we get uncomfortable. One, we start to add in a lot of extra words. So sometimes we just need to boil it down and say exactly what we need to say so there's no confusion. And then two, sometimes what happens is we introduce the word but, which I'm sure all of you have heard this before and then suddenly felt dismissed or it's caused a fight. But what we do when we do that is as soon as we say, I really appreciate the opportunity, but, or I really understand, but, whatever the case might be, we are automatically shifting into a you versus me mentality. So if we go to this, we're filling up too much space, we're giving a lot of people power, we're assuming there's a conflict, we're already preparing ourselves for that. And then again, if we use that word but, we start to create this distance between us and the other person. So making the shift from but to and is actually a way that you can be assertive in the room by allowing both things to be evident and parties to be considered. I really appreciate the opportunity, and at this time, it's not a good fit for me. Or you did a really great job this year working on your sales pitches. And one of the things that I really want to help you grow with is blank, whatever that might be. Okay, and then finally, we're just going to talk about a few quick changes to make in terms of our action. If you have questions, go ahead and start dumping them into the chat so we can kind of watch, and I know on time to make sure we have a few minutes to get to those at the end. So feel free to type those in. I can see it as well as Shannon. So the first thing in terms of our action is to do what's called acting as if. So we talked about this in the beginning in terms of a lot of times people play a role. People will, based on their shame or their fear narratives, act in a certain way in order to be belonging or to create a sense of belonging. Instead, what we actually want to do is act as if we are the person that doesn't need to change who we are. Act as if we're already assertive and confident. Act as if the outcome has already been exactly what we needed and wanted. And because, again, our brain is trying to oversimplify, if we start to act in a role or play a role where we feel as though things are actually going to work out, our brain has not already written that other story of, oh my goodness, there's a conflict and there's unknowns, it's going to be bad. It actually dumps different chemicals into our brain that allows us to maintain that sense of confidence. So I like to do this, and I pretend this all the time when I'm making a pitch. Act as if I'm the person that has already done $110,000 gigs. So when I'm pitching this, it totally is completely normal for me to pitch it. And I've heard yes before, and I've heard no before, and I've been fine. So really thinking about how can you create this sense of self and sort of preemptively write the story that you're going to lean into about your character and your life overall. The next thing is think about power posing. So if you haven't looked this up, there's a TED Talk on power posing by Amy Cuddy. It's amazing. It's fantastic. I will let her do all of the explanation just based on our time right now. But what she really looks at is thinking about how power posing shifts the brain. They did this looking at before people went into job interviews. And if you power posed for 2 minutes, just holding a specific physical stance, the chemical dumping in your brain was significantly different, and the confidence levels that people reported and how they performed was significantly higher. So again, you might leave that interview or leave that interaction and still feel completely like your worth and value is something that you're questioning constantly, but you've done a chemical dumping that actually for that moment gives you enough power that you can act as if that's not the case. Now, this is sort of a nod to the other handout that I was mentioning before. So I know I started to briefly mention it, but basically one of the things you need to think about is how are you spending your time, your money, and your energy every single day? How are you investing each of these three things, and what is the return on your investment? There are some things that inherently we might be willing to take a loss on all the time because it feels worth it to us. There are some things that we won't. And it's important that we start to look at it. It's like if you invested your money and you had a bunch of stocks, if you never looked at your portfolio and then suddenly you noticed, oh my goodness, I've been investing in this thing that over and over again, I'm losing handfuls of money, you'd be like, we need to invest in a different stock. So it's the same for this. If you want to make a shift in understanding your value, you need to reallot your time, your money, and energy in ways that are more in line with your internal values and passions and line up with who you want to be and where you want to go. And then you have to follow through on what you say. So if the thoughts and the verbal components are there, but you don't follow through on it, if I set a preemptive boundary that I've only got 10 minutes, but I give you an hour, I am indirectly taking away from the value that I just gave you or the value I communicated and what I'm expecting in exchange. So when I say something, I have to be willing to follow through on it. There are consequences either way. It's not just if you follow through, there's disruption, it's going to be hard, it's going to be bad. It's hard on either end. You have to ask yourself which payout is worth it. Feeling the distress of following through on that and somebody being disappointed, or continuing to not follow through on what you say and feeling as though you're not seen and heard. And then finally, practice more self-care and self-compassion. So if anyone is familiar with oxytocin, it's the chemical that is released with babies, with breastfeeding. It's also released during times of trauma, and it's released whenever we practice any type of compassionate care. And in particularly, the practice of self-care releases oxytocin in the body and strengthens our relationship with ourself. So if we have this negative self-talk, if we have these things we're telling ourselves that are negative and we want to shift it to something more positive, then what we want to do is actually be thinking about, can I implement more of a self-care practice every day to get that oxytocin release in order to help me build up that confidence to make those shifts in all those other aspects. That being said, we have reached the end. I see there are a couple questions. So are there any books reading on this topic? Yeah, absolutely. So what I can do is I can put together a couple different book recommendations on where to go next. In particular, are you all looking for books on communication? Are you looking for books on confidence and kind of making those identity shifts? I can send you a couple resources either way. I'm also going to be sending everybody some information on, I have a membership portal that's launching next month that is basically a culmination of resources on over 20 different topics. So busyness, communication, all of these different pieces. And so I will put together a bunch of that for you as well, so you can have some information on that if that feels helpful. But I will make sure I put together, okay, awesome, confidence and identity. I will put together some book titles for you on that and send them to Shannon so that you can have them. They'll come out in the email. Any other questions that would be important for us to talk about? Oh, I really like this question. So thinking about things on how with silence. So looking at what's the difference if we are when we are silent and how we show silence, is there a difference in how we can be mindfully silent? And then if there's giving the silent treatment, or when it's becoming reactive, which is a great distinction when we talked about those 4 types of communication or communication styles between being assertive versus being passive, passive-aggressive, or aggressive. So what you want to think about here is whenever there is silence, ask yourself, what's your intention in the silence? So if the intention is, I want to prove a point, or I want to punish somebody, I know sometimes I do this, even still, I hate it, with my partner, where sometimes I'm annoyed because, something didn't happen in the way I want it to. And so I will not respond, or I'll respond kind of haphazardly, yeah, sure, whatever. Or I'll get an email that comes in that's really frustrating and I'll blow it off. Well, if I'm being honest with myself, my intention and the derivation of my feelings, it's all coming from a place of emotion. I'm inevitably giving them power because I'm responding to them. If instead I'm creating silence to allow for the opportunity that they can reflect, or they are responding in a way that is their own right, for the example of thinking like, when I make a pitch to somebody else, if I want to fill the silence because my own distress is getting in the way and I'm assuming something bad about me, or I'm feeling like there's a scarcity component, that's more of those thought-based pieces, and it has nothing to do with them ultimately. It's all my negative self-talk. So that's kind of that good check-in point for that as well. And I'm happy to go into that more. You can email me if you want me to talk about that a little bit as well. And then let's see, tools for inflection would be wonderful. Yes, so I will go ahead and see if I can find a couple good articles to send you. There's also a couple really good books that I think would be great when you think about, if anyone has heard of the book Nonviolent Communication, and there's a few other that really talk about how we communicate in a place that holds a steadiness, rather than, again, kind of shifting into those different places of defensiveness or passiveness. So that's really incredibly important. I also think if we can talk, and again, I'll look for some other resources on inflection and thinking about how to make those shifts and how to be more mindful. I am creating a couple of resources right now for the membership portal on doing some assessments of that and how we track it and ways we can start to bring more self-awareness as well. So I'll have some of those too. And then I saw one other question coming in. Yeah, so I think that, again, this idea of being positively disengaged and not doing something versus being passive aggressive, all of it really comes back to, again, what's my intention? So this really is a question of how you want to spend your resources. There are some people that, yeah, have no interest in playing the game. I got to the point where I didn't want to do that, right? I thought it was dumb. People hurt themselves and it felt stupid over time. I wanted to go do other things. And so there's a difference in me making a choice of how I spend my resources, again, time, money, and energy, in the things that I want to and that align with me, if it's for me or if I'm doing it because of some response to other people. So there's just disengaging and isolating based on a shame response, which is usually when we feel like there's such a threat to belonging that we're going to take ourselves out of the equation or isolate, because otherwise we're going to be made to be isolated. So we do it so that we feel like we have some control. That's not super helpful, because that ultimately is us avoiding what we feel like is inevitable, and it comes from negative self-talk. Or the second part of it, where again, it might be in response, like in a passive aggressive setting, where we're pushing other people away as a form of avoidance. It still kind of roots back to shame, but it's really this idea then of thinking, the only way I have power is if I keep people at a distance from me. If instead it's saying, that's a great game, glad everybody's playing it, I have no interest in playing it, I'm going to go do my thing over here. The difference is then, again, it's not about somebody else or a response or a reflection on our perception of perceived value of ourselves. Instead, it's just saying, okay, you do you and I do me. Again, assertiveness, making space for everyone to be in the room. So if that doesn't answer your question more, Meg, let me know, or feel free to email me directly and I can go into that a little bit deeper with you as well. Any other questions? I know we're just over 1 o'clock, so I want to be mindful of people's time. If there's anything else that feels really pertinent to the group, go ahead and type it in. Otherwise, you have my contact information. It's also on the handout. It's going to be, you're going to get an email from Shannon with all of these other things. So you'll have all of that ready for you to go. Tools to most productively work. Yes, so absolutely. I think really thinking about, and Kyira, are you talking more specifically about like a workplace environment, more of a passive aggressive environment to, yeah, okay. I'll put together a couple things for you on that as well. I think the biggest thing is to really consider, there's two components of it. There's an awesome article, if I can find it, that talks about research that's been done on complaining and passive aggressiveness, and how the more we're around it, the more it actually changes and shifts our brains. So ways that we can make subtle shifts to setting boundaries kind of internally. I always picture like a mini me right here, shutting the door to that and using some guided imagery and some reflection. But then there's also some ways that you can set some boundaries in terms of your interactions as well to really help with that, particularly if that's the overarching theme in the environment. So I'm going to look for a couple of those, and I can send those to Shannon to go out as well. Or Carrie, you can also email me directly if you want to, and I'm happy to send you those specifically if you have more questions too. Awesome. Cool. Then I will go ahead and wrap this up and pass it back on so Shannon can wrap up everything that we need to and just kind of close this up. If anyone needs anything else, like I said, please feel free to email me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with all of you. This is such a great talk and topic that so many of us I know really want to go deeper on. And so I'm happy to support you in any way that I can. Thanks so much. And Shannon, I'll pass it back over to you.
Great, thanks, Kyira. So I will be sending out an email either the end of this week or the beginning of next week with the link to the recorded version of this webinar so you can review it later. And I will be sending out additional resources that Kyira will be gathering based on your questions, in addition to some content mentioned during the actual webinar itself. So look out for that email. Kyira is actually our first webinar presenter who is not an OE member. So please make sure to fill out the evaluation when I send that as well to give us some feedback on that. I have to say I really enjoyed it and learned a lot, and it was great having an expert in this area. So thanks so much, everyone. Check your email and enjoy the rest of your day.